Hello, my name is Jaymin Costa, and this presentation is about business communication in Sri Lanka. Up first, we'll talk about the norms and customs. Sri Lanka society has a deeply ingrained formal caste system with people in these levels placed in there based off of where they work or where they even just may live. This caste system is slowly starting to fade away as the generations go on. Sri Lanka also has much Western influence. This is due in part to a large period of time of British occupation. And as such, they share similar greetings to much of the Western world, such as a formal handshake. In their society, it is unacceptable for a man to touch a woman unless she is within the family circle. During more formal greetings, such as with a higher ranking official or a larger authority figure, it is much more respectable to press the palms together and bow instead of shaking hands, as that is seen as more informal. And in their society, there's a big emphasis on being polite and showing respect. Their culture has a large emphasis on building relationships, whether that be for business practices or for more just social relationship arrangements. And up next, we'll talk about the workplace norms. So a big thing with the Sri Lankan culture is that there isn't a huge emphasis on keeping time. This is most notable in a later slide about business meetings. And because Sri Lanka is a tropical island, they have very hot and humid weather. This is due to their placement right near the equator. And as a result, less formal attire is typically worn in business settings. In higher up corporate settings, you'll typically see suits much like the United States. But in typical, just normal business locations, you'll typically just find some people with a pair of pants and just like a tucked in button shirt. And the women in society follow a similar style, but they're restricted by the social norms of the society. For example, they cannot wear tighter fitting clothes, and so as a result, will typically wear more loose fitting dresses. Up next is verbal communication. The two most common languages in the country are Sinhala and Tamil. However, English is very common amongst the upper to middle class, especially in the business world. The chart on the left shows the change in language spoken at home from 2011 to 2016. And so it shows that most commonly people will speak Tamil. However, English is still relatively considerable. Again, this is just due to a large emphasis on speaking English during business practices, especially as they have a lot of Western partners. Another part of the culture is just being very polite. And as a result, they will typically speak in hushed or reserved tones. This is so that way they don't sound too assertive, and so that way they don't come across as being too impolite. And this goes hand in hand with their indirect communication. They will leave many of their conversations open-ended, and they won't directly speak their own ideals or do anything that would potentially make it seem as though they are being too assertive or that they are being too aggressive in their tone of voice or what they're speaking about. Next is the nonverbal communication. So much like the United States, conversations will take place at arm's length. This is just a sign of respect in making sure you're not taking up anybody else's personal space. Again, just like the United States, direct eye contact is held the entire time. And this is just, again, another respect thing. If you do not lock eye contact, then it can be seen as being unconfident or just not showing any respect to the person you're speaking to. However, unlike the US, in Sri Lanka, it is uncommon for you to lock eye contact with someone of the opposite gender, whether this be in more formal business meetings or socially, just around the street. And when people in Sri Lanka point at something, they will typically use their whole hand and gesture towards something rather than actually point at something with their index finger, because again, that can just be seen as impolite. Now we have business meetings. So like I mentioned earlier, the people in Sri Lanka have a different sort of idea of time. And as a result, meetings will typically begin later than scheduled. This is just because they have a much more lackadaisical approach to time and to making sure things run appropriately when they should. In the United States, the small talk before meetings is typically just generic conversation and doesn't really amount to anything. However, in Sri Lankan culture, the small talk at the beginning of meetings is very important. And they will use it to build up trust with all of the people in the room, or just get a read on how people are, how they're feeling going into the meeting. And like I mentioned earlier, there's a big emphasis on being polite. And as a result, they will speak in more hushed tones. And this is true even for meetings. They will typically not raise their voice. They will be sure to speak more reserved and more quietly, so that way they can't be seen as just being too aggressive in whatever they're trying to teach their audience. In the US, interruptions during meetings ruin the whole meeting, typically. This is just because there is a much more strict basis on how they should keep time, especially during meetings. However, in Sri Lanka, due to their lackadaisical nature and approach to keeping time, interruptions are almost beneficial, as it gives them more time to discuss whatever topic they are discussing during the meeting, or to sort of break down whatever they have previously talked about. Up next are the monopolies in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, just like the United States, has a big emphasis on promoting competition and disallowing monopolies. And for the most part, Sri Lanka is monopoly free. However, there are two particular companies who have essentially found loopholes in the business laws of the country, such as the Sri Lanka Railway System and the Central Electric Board. Each of these companies dominate their specific field. And as a result, there is no competition. And so there is no way for anyone to make more competitive prices, or to even have just remotely the same amount of power as they do. And this is the same thing in the US. There are companies, for example, in the power industry, such as Duke Energy in North Carolina in particular, where monopolies do still exist and are very hard to get rid of. And both countries are simultaneously trying to fight against those. Next are the business laws. Like I said previously, the United States and Sri Lanka have very similar business laws, with both having clear guidelines as to how long employees should work and how much money they should be making, and how much leave time they may have. However, unlike the United States, Sri Lanka has no specific laws defining discrimination protection in the workplace. Instead, these laws are left to, or these decisions about workplace discrimination are left to the companies themselves. And the companies themselves will make the decisions as to how they relegate discrimination, or how they avoid discrimination in the workplace. And they have similar competition laws as the United States. However, as I stated in the previous slide, there is a problem with monopolies finding loopholes in those competition laws. And lastly, we have the recommendations as to how you can more effectively communicate between the US and Sri Lanka. And so first, it is essential to know who you are meeting. In Sri Lanka, there is a large emphasis on how you greet certain people and how you talk to certain people, depending on their status in society. In a more informal basis, you may just shake someone's hand. However, in a more formal situation, such as meeting a higher ranking official, you will typically place your hands together and bow. And so it's important to know just who you are meeting, because their culture dictates how you are to talk to that person, or how you are to greet that person. The next recommendation is that patience is key, especially during meetings. As I've stated previously, Sri Lanka has a large emphasis on a more lackadaisical approach to keeping time. And so as a result, especially in meetings, they don't really start things on time, or they won't really mind interruptions. And this is very different from the United States, where everything is kept very direct by the clock. Everything is maintained at a certain period of time. And so it's important to just be patient during these meetings, and just kind of grow more accustomed to a much more slower, much more lackadaisical approach. The Next recommendation is to remain cognizant of gender roles in society. In Sri Lanka, there is a large divide between men and women in society. And as a result, it is important to remain aware of those gender roles and aware of how they are different. For example, as mentioned previously with the first recommendation of knowing who you are meeting, it's the same thing applies with remaining cognizant of gender roles. As, for example, you cannot shake the hand of a woman in society unless you are within the family. And so it is important to remain aware of those gender roles. In the US, you can really shake hands with anyone and everyone. However, in Sri Lankan culture, that is, for the most part, unacceptable in terms of crossing between genders. The next recommendation is to be aware of hand gestures. Both cultures, as in the US and Sri Lanka, will typically talk with their hands and gesture and make gestures in order to emphasize whatever point they may be talking about or what have you. However, in Sri Lanka in particular, it is rude to point. And during conversation, especially in American culture, you'll typically point out things or point to something if you are ever making a point or ever trying to direct someone. And so in Sri Lanka, you will use your entire hand instead of your pointer finger, as it is seen as unpolite. And the last recommendation is to not expect to see so many people in suits, especially during the summer months. In the United States, it is very commonplace for people, especially in higher corporate positions, to wear suits all the time. However, in Sri Lanka, especially during the summer months, it can be so hot and humid that many people won't wear suits at all and instead will wear more informal clothing as compared to the United States, where it'll just be more pants and button shirts. And so when communicating with them, don't be surprised if that's what you will see. And don't be surprised if that's something that you would almost want to join in on, as the weather there is very hot and it is very, very humid. Here we have all of the references for the presentation. And lastly, I just want to thank you all for watching the presentation. I hope the information provided will better help you more effectively communicate with Sri Lanka in the business world and become more aware and more in tune with their different norms and culture and everything over there. If there are any further questions, my email is below. Thank you.